Nothing prepares a child for the silence that follows when both parents are suddenly gone. 6-year-old Clara knew that hollow feeling as she was sent away to live with relatives she'd never met, carrying only a small suitcase and the deed to an old cabin her grandfather left behind. The relatives saw the run-down cabin in the Georgia woods as worthless. Clara found her only friend there, a raccoon who visited every day. When the raccoon showed her a loose floorboard, Clara discovered something hidden underneath. Old papers, maps, and documents that revealed her grandfather's secret. He'd been part of a land deal that hid mineral rights worth $200 million. Now Clara had to protect this discovery from adults who would do anything for that. And kind of money. But would a 6-year-old girl and her raccoon friend be enough to keep such a dangerous secret safe? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning light filtered through the dusty windows of the old cabin, casting long shadows across the wooden floor where Clara sat cross-legged, holding her grandfather's worn pocket watch. She'd found it tucked away in her small leather suitcase, the same case that now held everything she owned in the world. The watch still ticked steadily, a comforting rhythm that reminded her of better times when her world made sense. Just 3 weeks ago, Clara had been living in a cozy house in Savannah with her parents, where Sunday mornings meant pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse and bedtime stories about brave princesses and talking animals. Her mother would brush her hair while humming old songs, and her father would chase her around the backyard until they both collapsed in giggles on the soft grass. Those memories felt like scenes from someone else's life now. The funeral had been a blur of black clothes and whispered conversations. Clara remembered sitting in the front pew of the church, wearing her only dress, the blue one with tiny flowers that her mother had bought for Easter. Adults kept patting her head and saying things like, "She's so young," and "such a tragedy," but no one really talked to her. No one asked how she felt or what she wanted. They just made decisions about her future, as if she wasn't sitting right. And there, listening to every word, that's when Uncle Martin and Aunt Beth appeared. Clara had heard their names mentioned at family gatherings, but she'd never met them before. Uncle Martin was her father's older brother, a practical man with calloused hands and a no-nonsense attitude toward life. He wore work boots that clomped heavily on the funeral home's carpeted floors, and he kept checking his watch as if he had somewhere more important to be. Aunt Beth seemed kinder, with soft eyes that looked genuinely sad when she spoke to Clara. But there was an overwhelmed quality to her movements, as if she was already wondering how she'd managed taking care of a 6-year-old when she barely managed taking care of herself. "The thing is," Uncle Martin had explained to the lawyer handling her parents' estate, "we live in a small apartment above the hardware store. We don't have much room, and we certainly don't have money for extras." He'd glanced at Clara then, and she could see him calculating the cost of food, clothing, and school supplies. "But family is family, and we'll make it work." The lawyer had mentioned the cabin then, a property Clara's grandfather had left to her parents, and now to her. "It's been empty for 5 years, he'd said, shuffling through papers. "Sits on about 40 acres in the North Georgia mountains. Remote place, needs work, but the property taxes are current." Uncle Martin had perked up at that, asking about its value, but the lawyer had just shrugged. "Rural land in that area isn't worth much. Maybe you could sell it eventually, help with the girls' expenses." So they'd driven north from Savannah in Uncle Martin's pickup truck, Clara squeezed between her new guardians with her suitcase on her lap. The journey took them through small towns with single traffic lights and rolling hills covered in pine trees. As they climbed higher into the mountains, the air grew cooler and the forests thicker. Clara had pressed her face to the window, watching the landscape change. From the flat coastal plains, she knew, to something wilder and more mysterious. The cabin sat at the end of a dirt road that wound through dense woods for nearly 2 miles. When they finally reached it, Clara's heart had sunk. The structure was small and weathered, with a tin roof that showed patches of rust. Kudzu vines had claimed much of the exterior walls, and the front porch sagged under the weight of neglect. Tall weeds surrounded the building, and several windows were cracked or missing panes entirely. "Lord have mercy," Aunt Beth had whispered, stepping out of the truck and surveying the scene. "Martin, we can't leave a child here." But Uncle Martin was already thinking practically. "Place has good bones," he'd said, walking up to test the porch steps. "Foundation looks solid. Roof needs patches, but it's not falling in. Water pump still works. I can hear it running." He'd turned to Clara with what might have been an attempt at a smile. "Needs some elbow grease, but we can make it livable. Better than our cramped apartment, and at least here you'd have room to play." That first night in the cabin had been the longest of Clara's life. The three of them had camped on air mattresses in what had once been the main room, using battery-powered lanterns for light since the electricity hadn't been turned. And yet, every sound seemed amplified in the darkness. Creaking boards, rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl. Clara had lain awake, listening to Uncle Martin's snoring and Aunt Beth's restless shifting, feeling more alone than she'd ever felt in her life. It was the next morning that she'd first seen the raccoon. She'd stepped out onto the front porch, while Uncle Martin and Aunt Beth were still sleeping, and there it was, a large raccoon sitting calmly on the porch railing as if it belonged there. Instead of running away when it saw her, the animal had tilted its head and studied her with intelligent dark eyes. For several minutes, they'd simply looked at each other, and Clara had felt an odd sense of recognition, as if this creature understood her loneliness. Over the following days, as Uncle Martin worked to make the cabin habitable and Aunt Beth tried to clean years of dust and neglect from the interior, the raccoon became a daily visitor. It would appear each morning around sunrise and again in the evening, sometimes bringing small gifts, a shiny button, a smooth riverstone, once even a child's toy car that must have been lost in the woods years ago. Clara began leaving small offerings of food on the porch, and gradually the raccoon grew comfortable enough to eat while she sat nearby. "That thing's going to become a pest," Uncle Martin had warned, but Clara noticed he never actually chased the raccoon away. There was something about the animal's behavior that seemed almost protective, and even practical. Uncle Martin seemed to recognize it. The cabin itself held mysteries that revealed themselves slowly. Clara's grandfather had been a man she'd never known. He died when she was just 2 years old, but his presence lingered in every room. There were shelves lined with books about geology and mining, old photographs of him in work clothes standing next to enormous machines, and carefully labeled rock samples arranged on windowsills. One wall held framed certificates and awards, including something called a Distinguished Service Award from the Georgia Geological Survey. "Your grandfather was a smart man," Aunt Beth had told Clara one evening as they looked through his belongings. "He worked for mining companies all over the state, helping them figure out what was underground. Your daddy used to say he could look at a piece of ground and tell you everything that was buried beneath it." Clara had found her grandfather's pocket watch in a small wooden box on his bedroom dresser, along with a few photographs of a woman she assumed must be her grandmother, another person she'd never met. One photo showed her grandparents standing in front of this very cabin when it was new, looking young and happy with their whole lives ahead of them. Her grandfather was holding the same pocket watch she now carried, and her grandmother was smiling at something outside the camera's view. The cabin had 2 bedrooms, a kitchen with an old wood-burning stove, and a main room with a stone fireplace. Uncle Martin had managed to get the electricity working and the water pump running properly, and Aunt Beth had scrubbed the place until it was genuinely clean. They'd bought some basic furniture from a thrift store in the nearest town, a bed for Clara, a kitchen table, a few chairs, and gradually the space began to feel less like an abandoned relic and more like a home. But it was Clara's relationship with the raccoon that truly made the place special. The animal seemed to have adopted her, following her around the property and showing her hidden corners of the 40 acres that surrounded the cabin. There was a creek that ran along the back edge of the land, crystal clear and cold, even in summer. There were trails that wound through groves of oak and hickory trees and a small meadow where wildflowers bloomed in abundance. The raccoon would lead her to all these places, as if giving her a tour of her inheritance. One evening, as Clara sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, Aunt Beth had joined her. "You know, sweetie," she'd said, settling into an old rocking chair Uncle Martin had repaired, "I never expected to find peace in a place like this, but there's something special about these. Mountains, isn't there?" Clara had nodded, her grandfather's pocket watch ticking steadily in her palm. For the first time since her parents' death, she'd felt something other than grief, a sense of belonging, as if this remote cabin and its wild surroundings had been waiting for her all along. The raccoon had appeared then, as it often did at sunset, and had settled on the porch steps, as if claiming its place in this new family arrangement. Uncle Martin had emerged from inside the cabin, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "I have to admit," he'd said, looking out over the forest that surrounded them, "this place grows on you. Your grandfather knew what he was doing when he picked this spot." He'd paused, studying the landscape with new appreciation. Man could see things others couldn't, I suppose. Had an eye for what was valuable. As the stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky, Clara had wound her grandfather's watch and listened to its familiar tick. She didn't know then that the old man's greatest gift to her wasn't the cabin or the land, but the secret he'd carefully hidden beneath the floorboards, a secret that would soon change everything about their quiet new life in the Georgia mountains. The discovery came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Clara had settled into life at the cabin. She'd been following the raccoon on one of their daily explorations, this time inside the cabin itself. The animal had been acting strangely for several days, scratching at the wooden floor in the main room and chittering in a way that seemed almost urgent. Clara had grown to trust the raccoon's instincts. When it showed her the creek behind the cabin, she'd discovered the sweetest water she'd ever tasted. When it led her to a hollow tree, she'd found a nest of baby squirrels that needed protection from a coming storm. So when the raccoon began pawing persistently at a particular section of the floor near the stone fireplace, Clara paid attention. "What is it, friend?" she asked, kneeling down beside the animal. The raccoon looked up at her with those intelligent, dark eyes and then resumed its scratching at the wooden planks. Clara noticed for the first time that one of the floorboards sat slightly higher than the others, and when she pressed on it, it gave way with a soft creak. The board was loose, not just old and warped, but deliberately loosened. Clara's small fingers found purchase along its edge, and with some wiggling, she managed to lift it entirely. Beneath was a space that had been hollowed out between the floor joists, and in that space was a metal box about the size of a shoebox, wrapped in what looked like oiled canvas. Her heart hammered as she lifted the package from its hiding place. The canvas was old, but had protected the metal box from moisture and time. On top of the box was a small brass key tied with a piece of string to the handle. Clara's hands trembled as she inserted the key and turned it. The lock clicked open with a satisfying sound that seemed to echo through the quiet cabin. Inside, the box, carefully arranged, were papers, lots of them. Some were official-looking documents with fancy letterheads and ribbons attached. Others appeared to be hand-drawn maps with symbols and notations in her grandfather's careful handwriting. There were photographs, too, showing men in hard hats standing next to massive machinery, and pictures of what looked like rock formations and mining operations. Clara lifted the papers out carefully, the way she'd seen her father handle important documents. Most of the words were too big for her to understand completely, but she recognized some of them. Mineral Rights Agreement was typed at the top of several documents. Georgia Geological Survey appeared on others. There were maps that showed her property and the surrounding area, with symbols and numbers marked throughout. One document that caught her attention had her grandfather's name, Harold Eugene Morrison, written in bold letters at the top, along with words like exclusive rights and subsurface minerals. With the numbers on these papers were bigger than anything Clara had ever seen, figures with so many zeros that she had to count them twice to believe them. But it was a handwritten note in her grandfather's familiar script that made her stomach flutter with excitement and fear. "For Clara," it read, "when she's old enough to understand what this means. The land holds more than just trees and streams. Keep it safe until you're ready to decide what's right." Clara read the note 3 times, her grandfather's pocket watch ticking steadily in her other hand. The raccoon sat quietly beside her, as if it understood the magnitude of what she'd discovered. She could hear Uncle Martin's voice from outside, where he was repairing the front steps, and Aunt Beth moving around in the kitchen preparing lunch. Her new life had settled into a comfortable routine, but something told Clara that these papers would change everything. She gathered the documents carefully and returned them to the metal box, but kept the note and one of the simpler maps to study more closely. The map showed their property boundaries and had symbols scattered across it, little crosses and circles with numbers beside them. At the bottom, in her grandfather's handwriting, were the words "Survey completed, 1985, total, estimated value, significant, keep quiet until Clara can choose." That afternoon, while Uncle Martin was in town getting supplies and Aunt Beth was hanging laundry on the line behind the cabin, Clara spread the map on her bed and tried to make sense of it. She found their cabin marked clearly, along with the creek in the meadow where she liked to pick wildflowers. But there were other markings, dozens of them, scattered across the property with numbers that made no sense to a 6-year-old. When Uncle Martin returned from town, Clara's excitement got the better of her. She found him unloading groceries from his truck and approached him with the map folded in her hands. "Uncle Martin," she said, "I found something in the cabin. I think it's important." He looked down at her with the patient expression he'd developed over the past few weeks. "What is it, sweetheart?" Clara unfolded the map and held it up for him to see. "It's a map of our land, but it has all these marks on it. And there are papers that talk about minerals and rights and things. I think Grandpa left them for me." "Uncle." Martin glanced at the map, and Clara saw his expression change from patient interest to something more serious. He took the paper from her hands and studied it more carefully. "Where did you find this, Clara?" "Under the floorboard by the fireplace. The raccoon showed me where it was loose." "There are more papers." Clara nodded eagerly. "Lots of them. In a metal box with a key. They have big numbers on them and Grandpa's name and—" "Clara," Uncle Martin's voice was gentle but firm. "Listen to me carefully. Sometimes old papers like this can be confusing. They might look important, but they could be outdated or not mean what they seem to mean." He folded the map and handed it back to her. "Your grandfather was a good man, but he was also getting old when he died. Sometimes older folks hold on to papers that don't have any real value anymore." "But the note says—" "What note?" Clara realized she'd made a mistake, mentioning the note specifically for her. She could see Uncle Martin's practical mind working, trying to assess whether these papers represented any actual value or just the fantasies of an old man. "Just a note that says to keep the papers safe." Uncle Martin knelt down to Clara's level. "Sweetie, I don't want you to get your hopes up about something that probably isn't what it seems. Your grandfather loved this land, and he probably kept all kinds of papers about it, but that doesn't mean they're worth anything to anyone else." He smiled, but Clara could see he was thinking about something else. "Why don't you put those papers back where you found them for now? We can look at them together later, okay?" Clara nodded, but as she walked back toward the cabin, she felt a knot forming in her stomach. Uncle Martin's reaction hadn't been what she'd expected. Instead of sharing her excitement, he'd seemed almost dismissive, as if he didn't want the papers to be important. But the note had been clear. These were for her when she was ready to understand. That evening, after Uncle Martin and Aunt Beth had gone to bed, Clara retrieved the metal box from its hiding place. By flashlight, she looked through the documents more carefully. Even though she couldn't understand all the words, she could see that these weren't just random old papers. They were official documents with seals and signatures, survey reports with precise measurements, and photographs that showed serious-looking men doing serious-looking work. The raccoon appeared at her bedroom window, as it often did in the evenings, and Clara let it inside. The animal seemed to understand that she'd found something important, and it sat quietly beside her as she studied the papers by flashlight. One photograph caught her attention. It showed a massive piece of mining equipment beside a sign that read, "Morrison Property Geological Survey in Progress, 1985. Clara's grandfather had been more than just a man who loved the land. He'd been investigating it, studying it, documenting something valuable beneath its surface. And now that information was Clara's responsibility, even though she was only 6 years old and barely understood what any of it meant. As she carefully returned the documents to their hiding place, Clara made a decision. Uncle Martin might think these papers weren't important, but her grandfather's note had been clear. This was meant for her to decide about when she was ready. Until then, she would keep the secret safe, with only the raccoon as her witness. Outside her window, the Georgia mountains stretched away into darkness, holding their ancient secrets beneath layers of soil and stone. Clara didn't know yet that those secrets were worth nearly $200 million. Or that powerful people would soon be willing to do almost anything to get their hands on what her grandfather had discovered. All she knew was that the man she'd never met had trusted her with something important, and she wasn't going to let him down. The days following Clara's discovery took on a different quality, as if the very air around the cabin hummed with hidden significance. She found herself studying every document in her grandfather's collection during quiet moments when Uncle Martin was working outside and Aunt Beth was busy with household tasks. Among the papers, she'd discovered something that made her heart race. Her grandfather's leather-bound journal, filled with entries that painted a picture of a man who understood far more about their land than anyone realized. The journal entries were dated over several years in the 1980s, written in her grandfather's careful script. Most of the technical language was beyond Clara's comprehension, but certain phrases jumped out at her. Mineral survey confirms initial findings, keeping quiet until the right time, and most intriguingly, must protect this from the wrong. Hands. Clara had always been a bright child, advanced in her reading thanks to her parents' encouragement, but even she struggled with terms like subsurface mineral deposits and extraction feasibility assessments. What she could understand, however, was the excitement in her grandfather's writing, the sense that he'd discovered something extraordinary beneath the peaceful surface of their mountain property. It was during one of her visits to the small town library with Aunt Beth that Clara began to piece together what her grandfather had been so excited about. The librarian, Mrs. Henderson, was a kind woman in her 70s who remembered Clara's grandfather fondly. "Harold Morrison was one of the smartest men I ever knew," Mrs. Henderson told Clara as she helped her find books about rocks and minerals. "Used to come in here every week, checking out books about geology and mining. Always said this mountain range was full of surprises for anyone who knew how to look." Clara had chosen her words carefully when she asked her next question. What kind of surprises? Mrs. Henderson's eyes had twinkled with the pleasure of sharing knowledge with an interested child. "Well, these old mountains have been around for millions of years. They've seen ice ages and volcanic activity, continental drift and all sorts of geological processes. Sometimes all that pressure and time creates valuable things underground, metals, minerals, even precious stones." "Like gold?" Clara asked, remembering stories she'd heard about gold rushes. "Sometimes gold, yes, but also things like copper, iron ore, rare earth elements that companies use to make electronics and machinery. Your grandfather was particularly interested in something called mineral mapping, figuring out what's buried where and how much it might be worth." That evening, Clara had looked at her grandfather's maps with new understanding. The symbols and numbers weren't random. They were a code that showed where valuable minerals lay beneath their property. And if Mrs. Henderson was right about the kinds of things that could be found in old mountains, then her grandfather's excitement made perfect sense. The raccoon had become an even more constant companion, almost as if it sensed that Clara was carrying a weighty secret. It brought her gifts more frequently now, not just shiny objects, but interesting stones and bits of metal that it found around the property. Clara began to wonder if the animal somehow understood what lay beneath the ground it called home. Uncle Martin, meanwhile, seemed increasingly preoccupied with practical matters. Clara overheard him on the phone with someone about property taxes and maintenance costs, his voice carrying the strain of a man trying to stretch a limited budget. She also noticed that he'd begun asking subtle questions about her grandfather's papers. "Did you find anything else interesting in those old documents?" he asked one morning, as Clara helped him repair a section of the front porch railing. "Just maps and things I don't understand," Clara replied carefully. It wasn't exactly a lie. She didn't understand most of what she'd found, but she could sense that Uncle Martin's interest wasn't entirely casual. "You know, sweetheart, if there were anything valuable in those papers, it might help us take better care of this place. Fix the roof properly, maybe get some better furniture. Make sure you have everything you need." Clara nodded, but something in his tone made her uncomfortable. She loved Uncle Martin and Aunt Beth, and she could see how hard they were working to make a good home for her, but her grandfather's note had been specific. The papers were for her to decide about when she was ready. It was later that week when Clara first saw the stranger. She'd been playing in the meadow behind the cabin, with the raccoon foraging nearby, when a man in an expensive-looking suit emerged from the tree line. He walked directly toward the cabin with the confident stride of someone who belonged there, but Clara's instincts told her something was wrong. She ducked behind a large oak tree and watched as the man approached their front door. He was middle-aged, with silver hair and a smile that seemed too wide, too eager. Clara heard him knock and then heard Uncle Martin's voice as he answered the door. "Mr. Martin Morrison?" the stranger asked. "I'm James Harwick, from Harwick Development Corporation. I'd like to discuss a business opportunity regarding your property here." Clara crept closer, using the trees for cover, until she could hear their conversation more clearly. "I'm not sure what kind of opportunity you're talking about," Uncle Martin was saying. "This is just an old cabin on some mountain land. Sometimes the most unassuming properties hold the greatest potential," Mr. Harwick replied smoothly. "I represent investors who are interested in purchasing rural land in this area for development projects. We're prepared to make a very generous offer for your acreage here." Clara's stomach clenched as she listened. This man wanted to buy their land, her land, the place where she'd finally found peace after losing everything else in the world. "I appreciate the offer," Uncle Martin said, "but this property belongs to my niece. She's just 6 years old, so I'm managing it for her, but I couldn't make any decisions about selling without—" Of course, Mr. Harwick interrupted, "but surely a young child would benefit more from the financial security that a good sale price could provide, rather than being burdened with an old cabin that needs constant maintenance and expensive upkeep." Clara watched through the trees as Mr. Harwick pulled out a business card and handed it to Uncle Martin. "Just think about it. I'm prepared to offer well above market value for this property. It would solve a lot of financial concerns for a family, taking on the responsibility of raising a child." After Mr. Harwick left, Clara stayed hidden in the woods for a long time, thinking about what she'd heard. The stranger's words had sounded reasonable on the surface, but something about his eagerness to buy their land troubled her. Why would someone want to pay well above market value for what Uncle Martin had called just an old cabin on some mountain land? That night, as Clara lay in bed listening to the familiar sounds of the mountain forest, she thought about her grandfather's journal entries and his warnings about keeping his discoveries from the wrong hands. For the first time, She began to understand that the papers hidden beneath their floorboard might be more than just interesting old documents. They might be the reason a stranger had appeared at their door, offering money for land he'd never even seen before. The raccoon appeared at her window as it did most nights, and Clara let it inside. As the animal settled on her bed, she whispered her fears into the darkness. "I think someone knows, friend. I think they know about Grandpa's secret, and they want our home." The raccoon chittered softly, almost as if it were offering comfort and reassurance. Outside, the Georgia mountains kept their ancient secrets, but Clara was beginning to realize that some secrets were too valuable to stay hidden forever. Clara's understanding of her grandfather's secret deepened the day she found his detailed mineral survey map tucked between the pages of his journal. Unlike the other maps she'd discovered, this one was drawn with extraordinary precision, showing not just the boundaries of their property, but the underground landscape her grandfather had spent years mapping. The symbols that had puzzled her before now revealed themselves as a sophisticated coding system. Crosses marked drilling sites where her grandfather had taken core samples. Circles indicated areas of high mineral concentration. Numbers beside each symbol represented depth measurements and estimated yields. At the bottom of the map, in her grandfather's careful handwriting, was a legend that made Clara's breath catch in her throat. Confirmed deposits, rare earth elements, high-grade copper ore, trace amounts of gold and silver. Conservative estimate, 220 million USD extraction value. Even at 6 years old, Clara understood that $200 million was more money than most people ever dreamed of having. It was enough money to solve every problem her family faced, to secure her future, to change their lives completely. But something about her grandfather's notes suggested that he'd deliberately chosen not to pursue that wealth during his lifetime. Clara's research sessions with Mrs. Henderson at the library became more focused and urgent. Under the pretense of working on a school project about rocks and minerals, she learned about mining operations and mineral rights, about environmental impact and land preservation. Mrs. Henderson, delighted by Clara's apparent interest in geology, shared stories about the region's mining history and the boom and bust cycles that had shaped communities throughout the Appalachian Mountains. "Mining can bring great wealth," Mrs. Henderson explained one afternoon as she helped Clara find more advanced geology books, but it also changes the landscape forever. Your grandfather understood that better than most. He used to say that some treasures were worth more when you left them buried. The raccoon's behavior had become increasingly protective, almost as if it sensed the growing pressure surrounding their peaceful mountain home. It no longer just brought Clara interesting objects. Now it seemed to be conducting surveillance of their property, alerting her to any unusual activity or unfamiliar visitors. When Mr. Harwick returned for a second visit, the raccoon had chittered urgently at Clara's bedroom window until she came outside to investigate. This time, Clara positioned herself closer to the cabin, hiding behind the woodpile where she could hear every word of the conversation between Mr. Harwick and Uncle Martin. "I've done some research on this property since our last conversation," Mr. Harwick was saying, his tone more insistent than during his first visit. "The location has significant potential for development, and my investors are prepared to increase our initial offer by 20%. Clara watched Uncle Martin shift uncomfortably on the front porch steps. "Mr. Harwick, like I told you before, this isn't my decision to make. Clara is the legal owner of this property, and she's just a child. I can't sell her inheritance without compelling reasons and court approval. But surely you can see that holding on to this remote property isn't in the child's best interest," Harwick pressed. "The maintenance costs alone must be a burden on your family's finances, and what future does a 6-year-old have in these mountains? She'd be better served by the educational opportunities that financial security could provide." Clara saw Uncle Martin glance toward the cabin, and she wondered if he was thinking about the papers she'd found. Had he told Mr. Harwick about them? Did this stranger somehow know about her grandfather's discoveries? I appreciate your concern, Uncle Martin said carefully, but Clara seems happy here, and this was her grandfather's legacy to her. It feels wrong to just sell it off without understanding what he intended. Mr. Howick's smile became strained. Sometimes well-meaning relatives leave burdens rather than gifts. Empty land, especially in remote areas, can become more of a liability than an asset. He leaned forward, his voice taking on a more urgent tone. My investors are prepared to offer 3 times the assessed value of this property. That's an opportunity that may not come again. After Howick left, Clara watched Uncle Martin pace the front porch, clearly wrestling with difficult thoughts. That evening, as they sat down to dinner, he brought up the subject of their financial situation. Clara, honey, he began, taking care of you and this property is a big responsibility. Aunt Beth and I want to do right by you, but things like property taxes and repairs and your school expenses, they add up quickly. Aunt Beth reached over and squeezed Clara's hand. We're not complaining, sweetie. We love having you here, but your uncle is trying to be practical about the future. I found some more of Grandpa's papers, Clara said quietly, making a decision that felt both scary and necessary. I think maybe they're important. Uncle Martin set down his fork and looked at her intently. What kind of papers? Clara excused herself and went to retrieve her grandfather's mineral survey map. When she spread it on the kitchen table, both Uncle Martin and Aunt Beth leaned in to study it closely. These symbols and numbers, Clara explained, pointing to the markings scattered across their property, they show where Grandpa found valuable things underground. Mrs. Henderson at the library helped me understand what they mean. Uncle Martin picked up the map and examined it more carefully. Clara, where exactly did you find this? In the metal box under the floorboard. There are lots more papers like this one, and some that have really big numbers on them. Aunt Beth was studying the legend at the bottom of the map. Martin, look at this. It says something about millions of dollars in mineral value. Clara watched her uncle's face change as he began to understand what he was looking at. Clara, I need you to show me all the papers you found. Right now. 20 minutes later, the 3 of them sat around the kitchen table with the entire contents of her grandfather's metal box spread before them. Uncle Martin examined each document with growing amazement, while Aunt Beth helped Clara understand some of the more technical language. Your grandfather wasn't just a retired geologist, Uncle Martin said finally, his voice filled with awe. He was conducting a comprehensive mineral survey of this entire property, and according to these documents, there's a fortune buried under our land. Does this mean we're rich? Clara asked. Uncle Martin and Aunt Beth exchanged glances. It means, Aunt Beth said carefully, that your grandfather left you something much more valuable than we ever imagined. But it also means that we need to be very careful about who we tell and what we do next. That night, as Clara lay in bed with the raccoon curled beside her, she thought about how quickly everything had changed. Just hours ago, she'd been a 6-year-old orphan living in a remote mountain cabin with relatives who could barely afford to care for her. Now she was the owner of land worth more money than she could even comprehend. But instead of feeling excited about the wealth her grandfather had left her, Clara found herself thinking about his warnings in the journal, about keeping the discovery from the wrong hands, about protecting the land from those who would exploit it. Mr. Howick's eager interest in buying their property suddenly made perfect sense, and Clara realized that their peaceful life in the mountains was about to become much more complicated. The raccoon seemed to understand her worried thoughts, nuzzling closer as if offering comfort and protection. Outside their window, the Georgia mountains stretched away into darkness, holding their ancient secrets a little less securely than they had just that morning. The faded photograph Clara discovered, tucked behind her grandfather's mineral survey, changed everything she thought she understood about the stakes involved. The image showed massive mining equipment, bulldozers, excavators, and what looked like a strip mining operation that had left the landscape scarred and barren. On the back, in her grandfather's handwriting, were the words, "What they did to Miller's Ridge, 1982. Never here." Clara stared at the photograph, understanding for the first time why her grandfather had been so secretive about his discoveries. The beautiful forest surrounding their cabin, the clear creek where she and the raccoon played, the wildflower meadow where butterflies danced in the morning sun, all of it could be destroyed if the wrong people learned what lay beneath the ground. Mrs. Henderson helped Clara understand the environmental implications during their next library visit. Mining operations, especially large-scale ones, can change an entire ecosystem, the librarian explained, showing Clara books about environmental conservation. They remove topsoil, alter water drainage, and displace wildlife. Some landscapes never recover. But people still do it for the money, Clara asked. Unfortunately, yes. When there's enough money involved, some companies are willing to sacrifice environmental protection for profit. Mrs. Henderson's expression grew thoughtful. Your grandfather understood that better than most. He'd seen what unchecked mining could do to beautiful places. That understanding made Clara's stomach twist with worry, especially as Mr. Harwick's visits became more frequent and aggressive. He'd returned twice more in the past week, each time with increasingly generous offers and increasingly insistent arguments about why selling the property would be in Clara's best interest. During his most recent visit, Clara had hidden in her favorite listening spot behind the woodpile while the raccoon kept watch nearby. This time, Harwick hadn't come alone. He'd brought 2 other men in expensive suits who studied their property with the calculating eyes of people who saw only dollar signs where Clara saw home. The preliminary surveys we've conducted suggest this location has significant potential, one of Harwick's associates had told Uncle Martin. We're prepared to offer 4 times the assessed value of the property, plus relocation assistance for your family. What kind of surveys? Uncle Martin had asked, and Clara heard a new wariness in his voice. Just basic geological assessments. Harwick had replied smoothly. Nothing invasive, of course, but enough to confirm that this site would be suitable for our development plans. Clara's heart had pounded as she realized what was happening. Somehow, these men already knew about the mineral deposits beneath their land. They weren't just making random offers, they were targeting their property specifically because they understood its true value. The raccoon's behavior confirmed Clara's growing suspicions. The animal had become increasingly agitated, leading her to various spots around their property where she found evidence of recent disturbance. Small holes that might have been core samples, surveying markers hidden in the underbrush, even tire tracks from vehicles that had clearly been driven through areas where no roads existed. They've been studying our land without permission, Clara told the raccoon, as they investigated one of the suspicious sites. They know about Grandpa's secret. That evening, Clara made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. She approached Uncle Martin and Aunt Beth while they were sitting on the front porch, watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "I need to tell you something important about Grandpa's papers," she said, settling into the rocking chair beside them. "I think those men who keep coming here already know what's buried under our land." Uncle Martin leaned forward intently. "What makes you think that?" Clara told them about the evidence she'd found with the raccoon's help, the unauthorized surveys, the core sample holes, the tracks from heavy vehicles. "And today, I found this in Grandpa's papers," she added, showing them the photograph of the destroyed landscape. "I think this is what they want to do to our home." Aunt Beth studied the photograph with growing horror. "Oh, Clara, this is what mining operations can do?" According to Mrs. Henderson at the library, yes. And Grandpa wrote on the back that he never wanted it to happen here. Uncle Martin took the photograph and examined it closely. "Your grandfather was trying to protect this land from something like this," he said slowly. "That's why he hid the mineral surveys instead of selling the information to mining companies." "But now they know anyway," Clara said, "and they're trying to trick us into selling so they can destroy everything." The three of them sat in thoughtful silence as the stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky. Finally, Uncle Martin spoke. "Clara, you need to understand something. The mineral rights your grandfather documented, they're worth an enormous amount of money. More money than most people see in their entire lives. If we wanted to, we could sell that information and make you wealthy beyond imagination. But we'd have to let them destroy our home. Probably. Large-scale mineral extraction usually means exactly what that photograph shows: cleared forests, strip mining, heavy machinery, and permanent changes to the landscape." Clara thought about the raccoon and its family, about the creek where she'd learned to skip stones, about the wildflower meadow where she felt closest to the memory of her parents. "I don't want to be rich if it means destroying all of this." Aunt Beth reached over and squeezed Clara's hand. "Your grandfather would be proud of you for saying that, honey. But you should also know that refusing to develop these mineral rights won't make the problem go away. Companies like Harwick's have ways of pressuring landowners to sell, especially when there's this much money involved." "What kind of ways?" Clara asked. Uncle Martin and Aunt Beth exchanged worried glances. "Legal pressure, mostly," Uncle Martin explained. "They might try to claim we're not managing your inheritance properly, or that holding on to undeveloped valuable resources isn't in your best interest. They could even try to use eminent domain laws if they can convince local government that mining operations would provide significant economic benefits to the community." Clara felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain evening air. "Could they take our land away from us?" "It would be difficult," Aunt Beth said carefully, "but not impossible, especially if they have enough money and influence to hire the right lawyers and lobbyists." That night, Clara lay awake thinking about everything she'd learned. Her grandfather's gift had seemed like such a wonderful discovery at first, proof that her family had left her something valuable, something that connected her to the grandfather she'd never known. But now she understood that great wealth often came with great complications. The raccoon appeared at her window, as it did most nights, and Clara let it inside. As the animal settled beside her on the bed, she whispered her fears into the darkness. "What would Grandpa want me to do, friend? Keep the secret and risk losing our home, or find some other way to protect what he left for me?" The raccoon chittered softly, and Clara imagined it was offering the same advice her grandfather might have given. "Be patient, be smart, and remember that the most valuable things in life couldn't be measured in dollars and cents." Outside her window, the Georgia mountains kept their ancient secrets. But Clara was beginning to understand that some secrets were too important to keep hidden forever, and too dangerous to reveal to the wrong people. Clara's research at the library had revealed disturbing information about mining operations throughout Appalachia. She'd seen photographs of mountaintop removal, of streams poisoned by mining runoff, of communities displaced by industrial development. Each image reinforced her understanding of what her grandfather had been trying to prevent. The raccoon had continued showing her evidence of unauthorized activity on their property. Fresh tire tracks appeared regularly in areas where no vehicles should have access. Clara found plastic flags marking survey points, and she'd even discovered what looked like core sample holes drilled near the creek where she and the raccoon played daily. "They're studying our land like they already own it," Clara told Mrs. Henderson during their next library visit. "Is that legal?" Mrs. Henderson frowned thoughtfully. "Without permission from the property owner? Absolutely not. If someone is conducting surveys on your land without authorization, that's trespassing at minimum, possibly criminal mischief." Clara made careful mental notes of everything she'd observed, documenting the locations where she'd found evidence of intrusion. Her grandfather's methodical approach to record-keeping was apparently hereditary, and she found herself naturally organizing information in ways that would be useful if legal action became necessary. The pressure from Harwick Development continued to escalate. Their most recent visit had included not just the smooth-talking Mr. Harwick, but also what appeared to be a surveyor and someone who introduced himself as a land acquisition specialist. Clara had watched from her bedroom window as these men walked the perimeter of their property with equipment, measuring and photographing everything with the confidence of people who expected to own what they were studying. Uncle Martin's patience was clearly wearing thin. Clara had overheard him on the phone with someone, probably a lawyer, asking about property rights and what protections existed against aggressive development companies. The stress was showing on both her guardians, and Clara knew that the financial pressure of maintaining the cabin and caring for her was making Harwick's generous offers increasingly tempting. But every time Clara looked at the photograph of the destroyed landscape, she felt her resolve strengthen. Her grandfather had trusted her with this decision, and she was determined not to let greed overcome the wisdom he'd tried to pass down to her. The letter that would change everything was hidden in a place Clara never would have found without the raccoon's help. She'd been following her furry friend on one of their morning explorations when it led her to an old oak tree at the far edge of their property. The tree had a hollow about 6 feet up its trunk, and the raccoon chittered urgently while looking up at it. Clara had to climb carefully, using the rough bark for handholds, but when she reached the hollow, she found another oiled canvas package, smaller than the one beneath the floorboards, but clearly placed there with the same careful attention to protection from weather and time. Inside was a single envelope, sealed with wax and addressed in her grandfather's familiar handwriting. For Clara, when she's old enough to understand. Her hands trembled as she broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. Her grandfather's words seemed to speak directly to her across the years, as if he'd somehow known she would face exactly the situation that now threatened their peaceful mountain home. "My dear granddaughter," the letter began, "if you're reading this, it means you've discovered what I spent the last years of my life trying to protect. The land you've inherited holds treasures that could make you wealthy beyond imagination. But wealth of that kind always comes with a price that may be too high to pay. I was a geologist for most of my working life, and I've seen what happens when greed overcomes wisdom. I've watched beautiful landscapes destroyed for the minerals beneath them, seen communities torn apart by the promise of easy money, and witnessed the environmental damage that can last for generations after the mining companies have taken their profits and moved on. When I discovered the rare earth deposits beneath our family land, my first instinct was excitement. The financial security such a discovery could provide seemed like a blessing. But as I researched what large-scale mineral extraction would mean for this place we love, I realized that some gifts come with responsibilities that matter more than the immediate benefits they might provide. Clara, you are still very young as I write this letter, but I have faith that when the time comes for you to make these difficult decisions, you will have the wisdom to choose what's right rather than what's easy. The mineral rights I've documented belong to you absolutely and completely. No mining company, no matter how large or influential, can take them from you without your consent. But remember, that consent means more than just signing papers. It means understanding the full consequences of your choices, not just for yourself, but for the land that has sheltered our family, for the wildlife that calls these mountains home, and for the future generations who might benefit from your stewardship. Rather than your exploitation of what lies buried here, I've hidden multiple copies of the mineral surveys and documentation around the property. If anyone tries to pressure you or your guardians into making hasty decisions, remember that knowledge is power, and the truth about what this land contains cannot be suppressed if you're careful to preserve the evidence. Most importantly, trust your instincts about people and their motivations. Those who would exploit these resources care nothing for you or this land. They see only profit margins and extraction opportunities. But there are others who will support your right to make your own choices about your inheritance, who understand that true wealth comes from protecting what you love rather than selling it to the highest bidder. I love you, Clara, though we may never meet in this life. I have faith that you will make choices that honor both your own future and the legacy of this beautiful place that has been our family's home for generations." The letter was signed simply, "Your grandfather Harold," but below his signature was a postscript that made Clara's heart race. "Remember that you are not alone in this. The land itself will provide allies if you know how to look for them. Clara." Read the letter 3 times, sitting in the hollow of the old oak tree with the raccoon watching protectively nearby. Her grandfather's words filled her with a strange mixture of pride and terror. Pride that he had trusted her with such an enormous responsibility, and terror at the magnitude of the decisions she would eventually have to make. When she climbed down from the tree, the raccoon led her on what seemed like a deliberate tour of their property, stopping at spots Clara now recognized as locations marked on her grandfather's mineral survey maps. At each stop, the animal would scratch at the ground or chitter at particular rocks and formations, almost as if it was showing her the specific places where valuable minerals lay buried. But it was what the raccoon showed her next that truly opened Clara's eyes to the full scope of her grandfather's preparations. In a grove of pine trees near the creek, the animal led her to what looked like just another moss-covered boulder. But when Clara examined it more closely, she found that the boulder was actually hollow, and inside was another waterproof container with additional copies of all her grandfather's documentation. Over the next several days, with the raccoon as her guide, Clara discovered 4 more hiding places scattered across their 40 acres. Her grandfather had been incredibly thorough, ensuring that no single disaster or theft could destroy the evidence of what lay beneath their land. Each cache contained complete copies of the mineral surveys, the legal documents establishing Clara's ownership of the mineral rights, and photographs documenting the value of what had been discovered. But the most important discovery came when Clara found her grandfather's original mining company contract, a document that revealed something that changed everything she thought she understood about their situation. The contract, dated 1923, was between Clara's great-great-grandfather and the Consolidated Mining Corporation. But as Clara struggled to understand the legal language, she realized something extraordinary. The contract had never been completed. Her ancestor had agreed to sell the mineral rights for what was then considered a substantial sum, but according to the documentation, the mining company had never made the final payment required to complete the transaction. That meant the mineral rights had never actually been sold. For more than a century, Clara's family had retained complete ownership of everything buried beneath their land, even though everyone, including the mining companies who had been conducting unauthorized surveys, assumed those rights had been sold decades ago. Clara's excitement was tempered by a growing understanding of just how dangerous her situation had become. If companies like Harwick's knew about the mineral deposits but didn't realize that Clara actually owned the rights to extract them, they were operating under the assumption that they could simply pressure her family into selling the land itself. But if they discovered that she owned the mineral rights outright, rights that were worth nearly $200 million, the pressure they would bring to bear might be more than a 6-year-old and her guardians could withstand. That evening, as Clara sat on the front porch with Uncle Martin and Aunt Beth, watching the Raccoon family emerge for their nightly foraging, she made a decision about how much to reveal and how much to keep hidden for now. "I found another letter from Grandpa. Today," she said carefully. "He explains more about why he hid the mineral surveys." She showed them the letter, watching their faces as they read her grandfather's words about the responsibilities that came with such a discovery. But she didn't mention the original mining contract or the 4 additional caches of documents she'd found. Some secrets Clara was learning were too dangerous to share until she was absolutely certain who could be trusted with them. As the stars appeared in the clear mountain sky, Clara felt the weight of her grandfather's trust settling on her young shoulders. She was only 6 years old, but she was learning that some circumstances demand maturity beyond one's years, and that the most important decisions in life often come when you feel least prepared to make them. The night everything changed began like any other, with Clara reading by flashlight in her bedroom while the raccoon dozed peacefully on the windowsill. She'd been studying her great-great-grandfather's mining contract, trying to understand exactly what the incomplete transaction meant for her family's legal position, when she heard the sound of vehicles coming up their dirt road. Clara checked the clock beside her bed. It was nearly midnight, far too late for any legitimate visitors. The raccoon had awakened at the first sound of engines and was now chittering softly, its fur standing on end in a way Clara had learned meant danger was approaching. She crept to her bedroom window and peered through the curtains. 3 black SUVs were parked in their yard, and men in dark clothing were emerging from the vehicles. Even in the moonlight, Clara could see that these weren't the businessmen who usually accompanied Mr. Harwick. These men moved with purpose and wore what looked like security company uniforms. Clara's heart pounded as she realized what was happening. Someone had decided that polite offers and legal pressure weren't working fast enough. They were coming for her grandfather's documents, and they weren't planning to ask permission. She heard Uncle Martin's voice from the front of the cabin. He'd obviously been awakened by the vehicles and gone to investigate. "Can I help you, gentlemen? It's pretty late for a social call." "Mr. Morrison," came a voice Clara recognized as Mr. Harwick's. "We apologize for the late hour, but we have reason to believe there may be stolen property on your premises. We have legal authorization to conduct a search." "Stolen property? What are you talking about?" Clara didn't wait to hear more. Moving as quietly as she could, she slipped out of bed and began gathering the most important documents from her grandfather's collection. The original mining contract, the detailed mineral surveys, her grandfather's letter, these were the papers that proved her family's rightful ownership of the mineral rights. The raccoon seemed to understand the urgency of the situation. It climbed down from the windowsill and began making soft, chittering sounds, as if trying to help Clara decide what was most important to save. "Shh, friend," Clara whispered, stuffing papers into her small backpack. "We have to get these somewhere. Safe." She could hear the conversation on the front porch growing more heated. Uncle Martin was demanding to see a search warrant, while Harwick's men were claiming they had the right to look for geological survey equipment and documentation that may have been improperly removed from a previous research site. Clara realized they were using legal language to justify searching for her grandfather's papers, probably hoping to find them before Uncle Martin or Aunt Beth could fully understand their significance. But she also knew that if they found the documents, especially the original mining contract, her family's claim to the mineral rights might disappear forever. Moving carefully through the dark cabin, Clara made her way to the back door. The raccoon followed her, occasionally chittering softly as if offering encouragement. Once outside, she could hear the men entering the cabin, their heavy footsteps and the sound of furniture being moved as they began their search. The raccoon led her through the forest paths they'd explored together so many times, but tonight their familiar journey felt desperate and urgent. Clara's backpack held everything that proved her grandfather's discoveries and her family's legal rights, and she knew that losing these papers would mean losing everything they'd worked to protect. They reached the old oak tree where Clara had found her grandfather's letter, and she realized the raccoon was showing her the perfect hiding place. The tree's hollow was too high and too small for adult men to reach easily, and even if they found it, they'd have no reason to suspect it. Contained anything important? Clara climbed carefully, her backpack making the ascent more difficult than usual. But when she reached the hollow, she found something that made her gasp with surprise and hope. Her grandfather had left more than just letters in this hiding place. There was another metal box, larger than the one beneath the floorboards, and inside it were documents that changed everything. Clara thought she understood about her situation. The box contained the complete legal history of the mineral rights to their property, including correspondence with lawyers and mining companies that revealed a truth no one else seemed to know. Not only had the original 1923 mining contract never been completed, but several subsequent attempts by various companies to claim the mineral rights had also been legally invalid. More importantly, the box contained a letter from a law firm in Atlanta, dated just 6 months before her grandfather's death, confirming that Clara's family held clear and undisputed title to all mineral rights associated with the Morrison property, with estimated current market value exceeding $200 million. Clara's hands trembled as she read the letter. Her grandfather hadn't just discovered valuable minerals. He'd spent years ensuring that his family's legal claim to those minerals was absolutely unshakable. Every document was properly notarized, every legal requirement had been met, and every potential challenge had been anticipated and addressed. But the most shocking discovery was a folder marked Harwick Development Corporation, Investigation Results. Inside were documents that revealed Mr. Harwick's company had been conducting unauthorized geological surveys throughout the region for more than 2 years, specifically targeting properties where they suspected valuable mineral deposits might exist. According to her grandfather's research, Harwick's usual method was to identify properties with potential mineral wealth, then use various forms of pressure, legal threats, inflated purchase offers, and sometimes intimidation to force landowners to sell for far less than their properties were actually worth. Once they owned the land, they would conduct their own mining operations or sell the mineral rights to larger companies for enormous profits. The folder included copies of complaints filed against Harwick Development by other property owners, documentation of their illegal survey activities, and even photographs of environmental damage caused by their mining operations in other locations. Clara's grandfather had been building a comprehensive case against the company, apparently planning to use this information to protect not just his own property, but other landowners who were being targeted by similar tactics. As Clara studied these revelations by moonlight, she could hear the men searching the cabin below, growing more frustrated. They were looking for something specific, probably the mineral survey maps and legal documents that would prove the land's value, but they weren't finding what they expected. The raccoon chittered softly, and Clara looked up to see why her friend was concerned. Through the trees, she could see flashlight beams moving through the forest. Some of Harwick's men had begun searching the property itself, probably looking for other hiding places where important documents might be concealed. Clara realized she was witnessing more than just an illegal search of their property. This was an attempt to steal her inheritance by destroying the legal proof of her family's mineral rights. If Harwick could eliminate the documentation of her grandfather's surveys and the legal papers establishing their ownership, he could then claim the mineral deposits for his own company. But her grandfather had been too smart and too careful to let that happen. The documents Clara now held proved not only that her family owned mineral rights worth $200 million, but also that Harwick Development had been conducting criminal activities in their attempts to steal those rights from legitimate landowners. As the search of the cabin continued below and the flashlight beams moved closer to her hiding place, Clara made a decision that felt both terrifying and necessary. She couldn't just hide these papers and hope the problem would go away. She had to find a way to use them to protect not just her own family, but all the other families Harwick had been targeting. The raccoon seemed to understand her resolve. It climbed down from the tree and stood waiting, as if ready to guide her to whatever came next. Clara carefully secured the most important documents in her backpack and began her descent. She might be only 6 years old, but she was about to become the key witness in exposing a conspiracy that threatened families throughout the Georgia mountains. And she had the evidence to prove everything, hidden safely away from the men who thought they could intimidate a child into giving up her birthright. The night that had begun with an illegal search would end with Clara holding all the cards in. A game much larger and more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Her grandfather's preparations had been even more thorough than she'd realized, and now it was time to discover just how much power the truth could wield against those who thought they could take whatever they wanted through force and deception. Dawn was breaking over the Georgia mountains when Clara finally made her way back to the cabin, her backpack heavy with the evidence that would change everything. The black SUVs were gone, but the aftermath of their search was evident in the overturned furniture and scattered belongings that greeted her when she slipped through the back door. Uncle Martin and Aunt Beth were sitting at the kitchen table, both looking exhausted and shaken. When Clara appeared in the doorway, Aunt Beth rushed to embrace her. "Thank God you're safe," she whispered, holding Clara tight. "When we couldn't find you in your room, we were terrified they'd taken you." "I hid in the woods with the papers," Clara said simply. "Grandpa taught me to protect what's important." Uncle Martin looked up from the legal documents scattered across the table, papers the searchers had pulled from various hiding places but apparently hadn't recognized as significant. "Clara, what those men did tonight was illegal. They claimed they had authorization to search for stolen property, but when I demanded to see a warrant, they couldn't produce one." Clara sat down at the table and carefully removed the documents she'd retrieved from her grandfather's secret cache. "I found something that explains why they came here," she said, spreading the papers before her guardians. "And I think it proves they're the ones who've been stealing." For the next hour, Clara walked Uncle Martin and Aunt Beth through everything she'd discovered. The incomplete mining contracts, the illegal surveys Harwick had been conducting throughout the region, the evidence that her family held clear legal title to mineral rights worth $200 million. Most importantly, she showed them her grandfather's investigation into Harwick Development's criminal activities. Uncle Martin studied the documents with growing amazement and anger. "Your grandfather documented everything," he said. "Harwick's been running a systematic operation to defraud property owners throughout this region, and Harold was building a case to stop them." "But why didn't he take action while he was alive?" Aunt Beth asked. Clara found the answer in one of her grandfather's final letters. "He was waiting until I was old enough to make my own decisions," she explained. "He wanted me to choose what to do with the mineral rights, but he also wanted to make sure I had all the information I needed to protect myself from people like Mr. Harwick." That afternoon, Uncle Martin placed a call to the law firm in Atlanta that had been working with Clara's grandfather. Within hours, they were visited by two attorneys who confirmed what Clara had discovered. Her family's claim to the mineral rights was absolutely solid, and the evidence of Harwick's illegal activities was more than sufficient to pursue both criminal charges and civil litigation. "The question now," said Sarah Chen, the senior attorney, "is what Clara wants to do with this information and these mineral rights. She has several options." Clara listened carefully as the lawyers explained her choices. She could sell the mineral rights to a legitimate mining company and become immediately wealthy. She could lease the rights for a percentage of mining profits, providing long-term income while maintaining ownership. She could hold on to the rights indefinitely, keeping them as a financial asset for the future. Or she could take a fourth path that her grandfather had apparently hoped she might consider. "Your grandfather's notes suggest he hoped you might choose to create a conservation trust," Ms. Chen explained. "You could protect the land from mining while still benefiting financially from the mineral rights through careful, limited extraction that wouldn't damage the environment." Clara thought about the photograph of the destroyed landscape, about the Raccoon family that had made their property home, about the clear creek and the wildflower meadow where she'd found peace after losing her parents. What would a conservation trust mean? It would mean the land could never be strip-mined or damaged by large-scale extraction, the second attorney James Wright explained. but you could still authorize small-scale, environmentally responsible mining operations that would provide substantial income while preserving the landscape. That evening, as Clara sat on the front porch with Uncle Martin and Aunt Beth, she found herself thinking about her grandfather's words regarding the responsibilities that came with great wealth. The raccoon appeared, as it did most evenings, and settled on the porch steps as if it belonged there. "I keep thinking about what Grandpa wrote," Clara said, "about choosing what's right instead of what's easy." Uncle Martin nodded thoughtfully. "Your grandfather was a wise man, Clara, but you're the one who has to live with whatever decision you make." "I know what I want to do about the mineral rights," Clara said quietly. "But first, I want to make sure Mr. Harwick can't hurt other families the way he tried to hurt us." The next morning brought a convoy of official vehicles to their mountain home, FBI agents investigating Harwick's illegal survey activities, environmental protection officers documenting unauthorized intrusions on their property, and representatives from the State Attorney General's office building a case against the development company's fraudulent practices. Clara found herself at the center of it all, the 6-year-old girl whose grandfather's careful preparations had provided law enforcement with everything they needed to expose a conspiracy that had been operating throughout the region for years. She answered questions with a maturity that surprised the adults, guided investigators to the locations where Harwick's men had conducted unauthorized surveys, and provided documentation that proved the full scope of the company's criminal activities. Mrs. Henderson from the library arrived that afternoon, having heard about the investigation from neighbors. "I always wondered why Harold was so secretive about his geological work," she told Clara as they sat together on the front porch. "Now I understand he was protecting not just you, but all of us." "How do you mean?" Clara asked. Harwick Development approached several property owners in this area over the past 2 years, making similar offers to buy land they claimed was suitable for development projects. Some families actually sold, not realizing their property might have been worth far more than Harwick was offering. Clara felt her stomach tighten. "So there are other families like us?" "There were, until your grandfather's investigation started, making waves. The FBI told me today that your evidence has helped them identify at least 12 other families who were targeted by similar fraud schemes." That revelation made Clara's decision feel even more important. She wasn't just choosing what to do with her own inheritance. She was helping to determine whether other families would get justice for what had been stolen from them. On Friday morning, exactly 1 week after the illegal search of their cabin, Clara found herself sitting in a lawyer's office in Atlanta, surrounded by adults who were waiting to hear how a 6-year-old girl would choose to handle the responsibility of owning mineral rights worth $200 million. She'd brought her grandfather's pocket watch, and its steady ticking helped calm her nerves as she thought about everything that had led to this moment. The raccoon couldn't come with her to the city, but she knew her furry friend was waiting back at the cabin, probably keeping watch over their mountain home. "I've made my decision," Clara said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to announce. "I want to create a conservation trust like Grandpa hoped I would. I want to protect our land from being destroyed, but I also want to make sure the mineral rights provide income to help other families who were hurt by people like Mr. Harwick." Ms. Chen smiled approvingly. "That's a very mature and generous decision. Clara, a conservation trust would protect the environmental integrity of your property while still providing substantial financial benefits. You could easily generate several $1,000,000 per year through carefully managed, environmentally responsible extraction operations." "And some of that money could go to helping the other families?" Clara asked. "Absolutely. We could structure the trust to provide funding for legal assistance, environmental restoration, and educational programs in your community." Clara nodded, thinking about Mrs. Henderson's stories of other families who had been targeted by Harwick's schemes. "I want to do something else too. I want to make sure Mr. Harwick can't hurt anyone else." That afternoon, Clara gave a statement to federal investigators that would become a crucial part of the criminal case against Harwick Development Corporation. Her testimony, combined with her grandfather's meticulously documented evidence, provided prosecutors with everything they needed to pursue charges of fraud, conspiracy, and environmental crime. But more importantly, Clara's decision to create a conservation trust would serve as a model for other families who wanted to protect their land while still benefiting from its natural resources. Her grandfather's legacy would extend far beyond their 40 acres in the Georgia mountains. As they drove home that evening, Clara watched the familiar landscape roll past the car windows and thought about how much had changed since that morning, when she'd first followed the Raccoon to the loose floorboard. She was still 6 years old, still learning to read difficult words and tie her own shoelaces, but she'd made decisions that would affect her community for generations to come. The cabin came into view as they turned onto their dirt road, and Clara could see the Raccoon waiting on the front porch, as if it had been watching for their return. She smiled, knowing that her grandfather's careful planning and her own courage had protected not just her inheritance, but the home where she'd learned that the most valuable things in life couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. The courthouse in Atlanta was filled with people Clara had never expected to see together in one room. There were the federal prosecutors who had built their case against Harwick Development using her grandfather's evidence. There were representatives from other families who had been targeted by the company's fraudulent schemes. There were environmental lawyers, mining industry experts, and journalists who'd been following the story of the 6-year-old girl whose inheritance had exposed a multi-million-dollar conspiracy. And there, at the defendant's table, sat James Harwick himself, no longer the smooth-talking businessman who had visited their mountain cabin with false promises and hidden agendas. Today, he looked like what he truly was, a man who had built his fortune by stealing from families who trusted him. Clara sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing her best dress and holding her grandfather's pocket watch for comfort. Uncle Martin sat on one side of her and Aunt Beth on the other, both of them still amazed at how much their quiet life had changed since that morning when Clara had first discovered the loose floorboard. The judge, an elderly woman with kind eyes and silver hair, looked down at Clara with gentle attention. "Miss Morrison," she said, "I understand you have something you'd like to say to the court today." Clara stood up, her legs feeling shaky but her voice steady. She'd practiced what she wanted to say, but now that the moment had arrived, she found herself speaking from her heart rather than from her prepared words. "Your Honor," she began, "my name is Clara Morrison, and I'm 6 years old. I never met my grandfather Harold, but he left me something more important than money. He left me the truth about what was happening to families in our mountains, and he taught me that sometimes you have to be brave to protect what matters most." She paused, looking around the courtroom at all the adults who were listening to her with respectful attention. "Mr. Harwick came to our house and told us he wanted to help us by buying our land. But he was lying. He already knew our land was worth lots of money because of what was buried underneath it, and he was trying to trick us into selling it for much less than it was worth." The judge nodded encouragingly. "Can you tell us how you discovered this deception, Clara?" "My Raccoon friend showed me where Grandpa had hidden papers under our floorboard. The papers had maps and documents that proved our land had valuable minerals beneath it, but they also had evidence that Mr. Harwick had been doing the same thing to other families, lying to them and stealing from them." Clara's voice grew stronger as she continued. "Grandpa wrote me a letter explaining that he could have sold the mineral rights for a lot of money, but he chose not to because he wanted to protect our land from being destroyed. He wanted me to have the choice to do what was right, not just what would make me rich." Harwick's lawyer objected, claiming that a 6-year-old couldn't possibly understand the complex legal and financial issues involved, but the judge overruled him, with a stern look. "Miss Morrison," the judge said, "what did you decide to do with this information your grandfather left you?" "I decided to create something called a conservation trust," Clara replied. "It means our land will be protected from big mining companies that would destroy it, but we can still benefit from the minerals in a way that doesn't hurt the environment. And some of the money will help other families who were hurt by companies, like Mr. Harwick's." The prosecutor stood up to present the evidence Clara's discovery had made possible. Box after box of documents were submitted: her grandfather's mineral surveys, proof of Harwick's illegal activities, testimony from other affected families, and documentation of environmental damage caused by the company's operations elsewhere. "Your Honor," the prosecutor said, "the defendant stands accused of systematic fraud targeting rural property owners throughout northern Georgia. The evidence shows a pattern of deceptive practices designed to acquire valuable mineral rights for far less than their actual worth. The Morrison case represents not just attempted fraud, but conspiracy to commit theft on a massive scale." Harwick's defense attorney argued that his client was simply an aggressive businessman operating within legal boundaries, but the weight of evidence was overwhelming. Phone recordings, email communications, and financial records all painted a clear picture of deliberate deception and criminal intent. When it came time for Harwick himself to speak, he stood up and looked directly at Clara. For a moment, she saw something that might have been shame in his eyes. "I want to say," he began, quietly, "that I never intended to hurt families or children. I got caught up in the potential profits and lost sight of the human cost of my actions." He paused, still looking at Clara. "This young lady showed more wisdom and integrity than I did, and I have no excuse for that." The judge listened to final arguments from both sides, but Clara could tell from her expression that the decision had already been made. When court adjourned for deliberation, Clara knew that justice would be served, not just for her family, but for all the families who had been targeted by Harwick's schemes. As they waited in the courthouse hallway, Mrs. Henderson approached, with several other people Clara didn't recognize. "Clara," she said with tears in her eyes, "I want you to meet the Thompson family, the Washingtons, and the Kellys. They're some of the families whose cases were reopened because of the evidence you provided." One by one, these families thanked Clara for her courage in exposing the conspiracy that had threatened their homes and livelihoods. She realized that her decision to trust her grandfather's wisdom and stand up for what was right had protected far more than just her own inheritance. It had helped restore justice for an entire community. When the judge returned to deliver her verdict, the courthouse had grown so quiet that Clara could hear her grandfather's pocket watch ticking in her palm. The silver-haired woman looked out over the packed gallery with an expression that conveyed both authority and compassion. "In the matter of the State versus Harwick Development Corporation," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room, "this court finds the defendant guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, illegal trespass, and environmental crimes. The evidence presented demonstrates a systematic pattern of deceptive practices targeting vulnerable property owners throughout northern Georgia." Clara felt Uncle Martin's hand squeeze her shoulder as the judge continued. "However, this case represents more than just the conviction of a corporate criminal. It demonstrates the power of truth to overcome deception and the wisdom that can emerge when individuals choose principle over profit." The judge's eyes found Clara in the front. "Oh, Miss Morrison, your courage in preserving and presenting your grandfather's evidence has not only protected your own family's inheritance, but has served justice for an entire community. Your decision to create a conservation trust shows remarkable maturity and demonstrates that true wealth comes from stewardship rather than exploitation." The sentencing was swift and comprehensive. Harwick Development Corporation was ordered to pay substantial fines and restitution to affected families. James Harwick himself faced both criminal penalties and civil liability that would effectively end his career as a developer. Most importantly, the court issued permanent injunctions preventing any future unauthorized surveys or development activities on properties throughout the affected region. But the judge wasn't finished. This court also recognizes the extraordinary foresight of Harold Morrison, whose documentation and legal preparation created the foundation for today's justice. Mr. Morrison's conservation ethic and his faith in his granddaughter's judgment represent the kind of intergenerational thinking our communities need to protect both natural resources and family legacies. As they left the courthouse that afternoon, Clara was approached by a reporter from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution who asked her how it felt to be responsible for exposing such a significant conspiracy. "I wasn't trying to be responsible for anything big," Clara replied thoughtfully. "I was just trying to do what my grandpa would have wanted me to do. He taught me that when you inherit something valuable, you also inherit the responsibility to protect it for the people who come after you." The reporter smiled and scribbled notes. "And what do you plan to do with your mineral rights now that the legal battle is over?" Clara looked back at the courthouse where justice had finally been served. "I'm going to create that conservation trust, like I promised. The land will be protected, but we can still get income from the minerals in a way that doesn't hurt the environment. And some of that money will help other families and support programs that teach people about taking care of the land." That evening, back at the cabin in the Georgia mountains, Clara sat on the front porch with the Conservation Trust documents spread on a small table beside her. Ms. Chen had explained that the legal framework was now in place to ensure that Clara's property would be permanently protected from destructive mining while still providing substantial income through carefully managed, environmentally responsible extraction operations. The Raccoon appeared as the sun began to set, bringing with it 3 smaller raccoons that Clara realized must be its babies. The little family settled on the porch steps, as if claiming their place in the celebration, and Clara smiled at the symbolism of new generations taking their place in the ongoing story of their mountain home. Uncle Martin and Aunt Beth joined her on the porch, both of them still processing everything that had happened since that first morning when Clara had followed the Raccoon to the loose floorboard. "I have to admit," Uncle Martin said, settling into his favorite rocking chair, "when we first came here, I thought this old cabin would be nothing but expenses and headaches. I never imagined it would turn into something that could change our whole community." Aunt Beth nodded, watching the Raccoon family with gentle amusement. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you, Clara, not just because you protected the family inheritance, but because you found a way to use it to help others." Clara wound her grandfather's pocket watch and listened to its familiar ticking as the first stars appeared in the clear mountain sky. The conservation deed she'd signed that afternoon would ensure that future generations could enjoy the same peaceful evenings, the same clear streams, and the same wildlife that had made this place feel like home. "You know what the best part is," Clara said, scratching behind the ears of one of the young raccoons that had ventured close enough to accept her attention. "Now other families get to keep their homes too, and their children will grow up knowing that sometimes, if you're brave enough to tell the truth and fight for what's right, you can protect the things that really matter." The Conservation Trust would provide Clara's family with financial security for generations to come. But more importantly, it would serve as a model for how communities could protect their natural heritage while still benefiting from the resources nature had provided. Her grandfather's vision of responsible stewardship had become reality, guided by the wisdom and courage of a 6-year-old girl who understood that some inheritances came with responsibilities that mattered more than money. 1 year later, Clara stood beside a newly installed wooden sign that read, "Clara's Conservation Trust, protecting our natural heritage," and marveled at how much their quiet mountain home had changed. The sign marked the beginning of a nature trail that wound through their 40 acres, educating visitors about environmental stewardship while showcasing the beauty that thoughtful conservation could preserve. The Raccoon family that had started it all was still there, now expanded to include several generations that treated the protected land as their permanent sanctuary. Clara had learned that her original raccoon friend was actually a female, and she'd named her Hazel in honor of the hazel trees that grew throughout their property. Hazel's offspring had grown up unafraid of humans, creating magical encounters. For the school groups that now visited regularly to learn about wildlife conservation and responsible land management, Mrs. Henderson had become the Trust's first full-time employee, serving as education director and helping Clara develop programs that taught children about geology, environmental science, and the importance of protecting natural resources for future generations. The library had donated books and materials for a small learning center that had been built near the cabin, and Clara often found herself explaining to visiting students how her grandfather's mineral maps had led to her understanding of what lay beneath their feet. The Conservation Trust had proven even more successful than Clara's lawyers had predicted. Careful, limited extraction operations were generating more than $3 million annually, while leaving the landscape virtually unchanged. Most of the income went into Clara's college fund and long-term investments, but substantial amounts also supported environmental education programs throughout northern Georgia and provided legal assistance to families dealing with fraudulent development schemes. The impact of Clara's case had extended far beyond their mountain community. Harwick Development Corporation had been permanently shut down, and James Harwick was serving a federal prison sentence while also facing civil lawsuits from the dozens of families his company had attempted to defraud. More importantly, the case had led to stronger legal protections for rural property owners and stricter regulations governing mineral surveys and development activities. Uncle Martin and Aunt Beth had adapted to their new circumstances with grace and wonder. The financial security provided by the Conservation Trust had allowed Uncle Martin to reduce his hours at the hardware store and spend more time maintaining the trail system and facilities that welcomed visitors to their property. Aunt Beth had discovered a talent for organizing educational programs and had become an advocate for conservation education throughout the region. But perhaps the most significant change was in Clara herself. At 7 years old, she had developed a confidence and sense of purpose that impressed every adult who met her. She spoke easily with visitors about environmental protection and mineral conservation, explaining complex concepts in ways that both children and adults could understand. Yet she remained a child who loved playing in the creek, reading adventure stories, and spending quiet evenings with Hazel and her growing raccoon family. This particular evening, as Clara sat on the front porch watching the sunset paint the mountains, in familiar shades of gold and pink, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this peaceful moment. The cabin had been fully restored and modernized, but it retained the character and charm that had made it feel like home from her. First night there, the wooden floors still creaked in all the same places, including the spot where the floorboard had once been loose, a small memorial to the discovery that had changed everything. Dr. Sarah Chen had become not just Clara's lawyer, but also a friend and mentor, visiting regularly to check on the Trust's operations and to discuss Clara's long-term plans for her inheritance. During her most recent visit, she'd brought news that several other families throughout Appalachia were creating similar conservation trusts, inspired by Clara's example and seeking to protect their own lands from exploitative development. "You've started something important, Clara," Dr. Chen had said as they walked the nature trail together. "Your grandfather's vision of responsible stewardship is spreading to communities throughout the region. People are learning that they don't have to choose between financial security and environmental protection." Clara had nodded thoughtfully. understanding better now what her grandfather had meant when he wrote about the responsibilities that came with great wealth. The money was important. It provided security and opportunities she might never have had otherwise. But the real value of her inheritance lay in the example it set for others and the protection it provided for the land she loved. The annual celebration of the Conservation Trust's founding had grown into a community-wide event that brought together families, educators, conservationists, and government officials from throughout the region. This year's celebration had featured presentations by environmental scientists, performances by local school groups, and guided nature walks that showcased the successful balance between conservation and sustainable resource development. During the celebration, Clara had been presented with a special recognition from the Georgia Department of Natural Resources for her contributions to environmental education and conservation. But the moment that had meant the most to her came when Mrs. Thompson, whose family had been among those targeted by Harwick's schemes, approached Clara with tears in her eyes. "Because of your courage," Mrs. Thompson had said, "my grandchildren still have their family farm. They'll grow up knowing the land their great-grandfather worked, just like you're growing up on your grandfather's land. That's a gift that can't be measured in money." Now, as the stars began to appear in the clear mountain sky and Hazel settled beside her on the porch steps, Clara wound her grandfather's pocket watch and listened to its steady ticking. The watch had become more than just a keepsake. It was a reminder of the continuity between past and future, of the way each generation's choices affected those who would come after. She thought about the letter she was writing to her grandfather, even though she knew he'd never read it. In the letter, she told him about the Conservation Trust, about the families they'd helped protect, about the students who came to learn about environmental stewardship on the land he'd studied so carefully. She told him about Hazel and her offspring, about Uncle Martin's pride in the trail system he maintained, about Aunt Beth's success with the educational programs. Most importantly, she told him that she understood now what he'd meant about choosing what was right rather than what was easy. The right choice had led to wealth and security, but more than that, it had led to purpose and the knowledge that her inheritance was being used to protect and nurture rather than exploit and destroy. As Clara prepared for bed that night, she looked out her window at the forest that stretched away into darkness, holding its ancient secrets safely beneath layers of protected soil. Tomorrow would bring more visitors, more students to teach, more opportunities to share her grandfather's wisdom about the true value of the land. But tonight, surrounded by the peace her choices had preserved, Clara Morrison fell asleep to the sound of Hazel chittering softly outside her window and her grandfather's watch ticking steadily on her nightstand, a rhythm that connected her to both the past she honored and the future she was helping to create.